A Navy salvage team hauled a rusted plane from the bottom of a quiet bay. At first glance, it seemed like another forgotten relic of war. But when the sealed hatch cracked, what spilled out made hardened sailors freeze in silence. Subscribe to the channel and write where you're watching this video from. Character intro. Commander William Hayes, 54, veteran Navy diver, had spent decades raising ghosts of history. But this time, the sea returned something that would never let him go. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The morning had started like any other operation. The deck smelled of diesel and brine, that sharp, metallic tang that clung to everything we touched. Chains clattered, gulls wheeled overhead, and the cranes groaned as they were tested before use. I'd been through this ritual 100 times, maybe more. Raise a wreck, catalog the pieces, hand them over to history. It was supposed to be simple. I pulled on my gloves, the familiar stiffness of neoprene gripping my hands. The deck beneath my boots vibrated faintly with the hum of engines below, steady as a heartbeat. Around me, the men joked and cursed, their voices half drowned by the slap of waves against steel. Routine, comforting in its way. But even as I tightened the straps on my gear, I caught myself staring at the horizon. The water lay flat and still, no chop, no wind, a glass sheet stretching all the way to shore, too calm, like the ocean itself was holding its breath. I shook the thought away. The job came first. We'd spotted the wreck days earlier, a shadow on the sonar, buried half in mud at the bottom of the bay. From above, it looked like nothing more than another war grave, the kind we'd all seen before. Planes went down fast in those days. They hit the water, broke apart, sank. You brought them up, and what you found was usually bones, rust, and silence. This one should have been no different. I reminded myself of what my father used to say when I was a boy, sitting at his feet while he told stories of the war. The ocean keeps secrets, William. Some it keeps forever. I always thought he meant the men who never came back, the pilots lost in dogfights, the sailors swallowed in storms. But as I pulled my hood over my head, the words clung to me differently, like a warning I hadn't heard until too late. The first glimpse of the plane came as the crane cables tightened and the sea began to give it up. Barnacles and weeds clung to the fuselage, green tendrils waving like hair as it rose. Rust had eaten deep into its skin, streaking it orange and brown. The cockpit glass was shattered, the frame bent and warped by decades underwater. I remember thinking, just another relic. I stepped forward with the others, crouched low, and ran my gloved hand across the slick metal. The surface was colder than it should have been, as if the sea had kept it frozen in its grasp. My gloves came away wet and slick, the slime clinging even after I wiped them on my suit. And then it hit me. The smell. It wasn't salt, or diesel, or the sour rot of seaweed. It was sharp, chemical, biting at the back of my throat like ammonia or bleach. My lungs seized, and I coughed hard into my mask, the sound echoing too loud in my own ears. The sting followed me into my chest, burning as I swallowed down air. I froze, staring at the wreck. Planes like this should have been nothing but skeletons of iron and aluminum, eaten hollow by the tide. They didn't bleed smells like that. They didn't cling to you. The men around me barely noticed. One of them laughed, called me old man when I stepped back a pace. Maybe they thought I was losing my edge, flinching at nothing. But I knew better. The sting stayed with me, deep in my lungs. I pressed my hand against the fuselage again, forcing myself to look closer. The metal wasn't just rusted. It was slick, almost greasy, like oil that refused to wash away. I rubbed harder, but the smear clung stubbornly to the fabric of my glove, as if it wanted to stay with me. I stood there, glove raised, staring at the stain. And then the thought came, sudden and sharp. My father always said the ocean kept secrets. I never thought one would claw its way into my lungs. The crane groaned louder, cables straining, water pouring off the wreck in dark sheets. A gull screamed overhead and wheeled away, wings thrashing as though it wanted no part of what we were pulling from the deep. I should have called it in. I should have told the men to stop, to cut the cables, to let the wreck sink back where it belonged. But I didn't. Duty held me there. Habit, pride, and maybe, if I'm honest, curiosity. Because even with the sting in my throat, even with my gut twisting like rope, I couldn't take my eyes off it. I bent closer, peering into the cracks where the fuselage had split. Darkness pooled inside, thick and unbroken. No fish darted out, no crabs scuttled from the seams. Just silence, as if even sea life had kept its distance. I swallowed hard, the taste of chemicals bitter on my tongue. The men shouted, guiding the wreck into its cradle on deck. Chains rattled, hooks clanged, and I forced myself back into motion, barking orders, trying to sound steady. My voice came out hoarse, raw from the sting, but none of them seemed to notice. Still, I noticed, and I couldn't ignore it. By the time the last of the water drained off the fuselage, my head was pounding, my chest tight. The smell wouldn't leave. It clung to me, filling every breath. I told myself it was fuel, trapped inside for decades, leaking out now that we'd dragged it into air. That was the simple answer, the reasonable one. But the words felt empty the second I thought them, because fuel didn't cling like this. Fuel didn't burn your lungs from one touch. And then came the final moment. As the wreck settled onto the steel, I coughed again, nearly doubling over from the burn in my throat. My gloves still slick with grease, my eyes watering from the sting. I straightened slowly and stared at the thing we'd dragged up. The men laughed, shouted, lit cigarettes in the corner. To them, it was nothing but another day's work. But I couldn't join them. I couldn't move, because deep down, I knew. Something about this wasn't right. Something about this was alive. The sting clawed my throat from a wreck that should have been nothing but rust. But soon, small details refused to stay hidden. The wreck sat heavy on the deck, dripping seawater and slime into the scuppers. The men busied themselves with cables and hooks, laughing like the job was done. But I stayed still, watching, my chest still raw from that chemical sting. It was then I saw the welds. At first, I thought they were just corrosion streaks of rust where salt water had chewed at the seams. But when I crouched lower, the light caught them. Not random. Straight, deliberate, beads of metal running across the hatch edges like someone had taken a torch to them. I blinked, leaned closer. Those weren't breaks. They were seals. I ran my glove across one seam, felt the ridges under my palm. My stomach tightened. These planes weren't welded shut in the war. They were meant to open, to let pilots escape if they survived the crash. But this hatch had been sealed from the outside. I stepped back, my boots slipping in the wet deck. Behind me, crews laughed at something one of the other divers said. The sound felt far away. All I could hear was my own breathing, ragged inside the mask, like I'd just sprinted a mile. "Fuel," I whispered. "It's just fuel." But even as I said it, the words tasted like lies. The air around the fuselage shimmered faintly in the cool morning, like heat rising off asphalt in the summer. The frost that clung to the steel was melting in odd patches, steaming only where the weld lines crossed the hatch. I felt my pulse climb into my throat. Fuel, I told myself. But fuel doesn't groan not like that. Because then it did. The sound came low, deep, metallic. A groan that rose from the guts of the wreck itself. The steel flexed, just slightly, like something had shifted inside. The vibration carried up my glove and into my arm, leaving goose flesh crawling up my skin. I froze, breath held, eyes locked on the hatch. Nothing. Just the drip, drip, drip of water falling to the deck. But I'd felt it. The groan echoed in my bones. I glanced around, but none of the others had noticed. Cruz was still talking, wiping slime off his gloves. The crane operator leaned on the railing, lighting a cigarette. Was I the only one who'd heard it? For a moment I wanted to tell myself I imagined it, that my ears were ringing from pressure shifts, from the dive, from the strain of holding my breath when the sting first hit my throat. But then, like a wave breaking from nowhere, a memory rose. My father's voice. "Some wrecks, son. They weren't sunk, they were buried." I had laughed when he said that years ago, told him it sounded like superstition, like sailors talk to scare kids. He'd looked at me then, eyes steady, and said nothing more, but his silence had been heavier than any explanation. And now, staring at the sealed hatch, the steaming seams, the groaning steel, I understood. This wasn't just a wreck. It was something someone had tried to keep down. My gloves were still slick from the first touch, a greasy smear that no amount of wiping would clean away. The smell clung in the back of my nose, bitter and chemical, until every breath felt poison. I turned away, tried to shake it off, tried to bury the rising panic under orders and procedure. I barked at the men to check the chains, to brace the fuselage, to secure it before inspection. My voice was too sharp, too fast. Cruz gave me a look. "You all right, Chief?" I nodded too quickly. "Fine, just fine." But I wasn't. Because when I glanced back at the plane, I could have sworn the hatch had shifted. Just slightly, a trick of the light, maybe. The fog was thicker now, rolling low across the deck, swallowing ankles, softening the edges of steel and rope. But no matter how hard I blinked, I couldn't unsee it. The seam looked wider. I clenched my jaw. I couldn't tell the men. Not yet. They'd laugh, brush me off, call me paranoid. I'd spent decades keeping calm in the deep, being the steady hand when others panicked. If I broke that now, I'd lose them. So I kept it inside. I swallowed the fear, forced my boots to move, forced my hands to check the cables, the hooks, the rigging. I told myself I'd imagined it, that the groan was the hull cooling. The steam was salt water hitting warm steel. But I knew. Deep down, I knew. The wreck wasn't done with us. I straightened, gloves slick, chest burning, eyes locked on that welded hatch. The fog swirled thicker, curling over the steel like smoke from a fire. And in the silence that followed, the truth clawed its way into my head. This wasn't just metal. This wasn't just history. It was something sealed, something buried, and something inside it had just moved. The plane answered with a groan as if something still lived inside. By now, denial was no longer enough. The wreck lay pinned to the deck, a black carcass bleeding seawater into the drains. Men moved around it, dragging hoses, securing clamps, making their usual offhand remarks about metals and history books. But to me, it wasn't just metal anymore. It was listening. I crouched low again, running my hand over the hatch seam. The welds caught beneath my glove like ridges on scar tissue. The chemical sting still clawed at my throat, but now there was something else, too. A vibration, faint like a pulse. I jerked my hand back. Russ didn't hum. Cruz wandered past, muttering under his breath, voice pitched just loud enough for me to hear. Hope it ain't humming a lullaby for us. His knuckles were white on the rail as he leaned in, trying to make it sound like a joke. But his eyes told the truth wide, fixed on the hatch, darting away the second I caught them. I gave him a quick grin, but it felt wrong, stretched too tight across my face. My smile felt brittle, my voice a stranger's. "It's nothing," I said, forcing calm into my tone. "Just the steel shifting after years underwater." He nodded, but neither of us believed it. The fog thickened as the morning wore on, rolling off the bay in low waves. It swallowed the deck until the plane seemed half vanished, its outline blurring into the mist. The men cursed as they fumbled with cables, their boots clanging against slick steel. Somewhere beyond, a gull cried and then went silent mid-call, like its throat had been cut. That silence gnawed at me. I stepped closer to the wreck, my boots slipping on water and slime. My glove brushed the side again, and this time it caught on something sharp. I bent down, held the light against the metal, and froze. Scratches. Not from the sea, not from time. Long, jagged marks carved into the steel from the inside. I pressed my face closer. The scratches overlapped in frantic patterns, shallow at first and then deeper, gouging the metal like claws. The deeper ones bent outward, bending steel that should have been impossible to move from within. My chest tightened. It wasn't corrosion. It was struggle. The memory of the groan from earlier surged back, rattling through my ribs like a warning I'd ignored. I swallowed hard, my throat raw, and forced myself to stand. "Chief?" Cruz called from behind me. He sounded casual, but his voice cracked halfway through the word. I turned too quickly. "Yeah? He pointed at the deck. "You see that?" I followed his finger. A thin trickle of liquid snaked from under the hatch, winding its way down the steel and dripping slow into the drain. At first I thought it was water, but then the light hit it. Black, thick, not oil. It clung in beads, glistening wet, heavy as tar. The smell hit a second later, sharper than before, a chemical sweetness that curdled in my gut. My vision swam. I staggered back, coughing into my sleeve. The liquid dripped faster now, as though pulled from inside by the weight of the air. "Jesus," Cruz muttered, covering his nose. He looked at me, searching my face for orders. For calm, for the steady chief I was supposed to be. And I tried. God, I tried. I squared my shoulders, forced my voice into something steady. Get the pumps ready. Might be old fuel, but the words felt hollow the second they left my mouth. I turned back to the wreck. The scratches glistened wet with that same black liquid, oozing slow and steady, seeping into the lines as though the plane itself was bleeding. My hand trembled as I reached forward, fingers hovering over the slick surface. The fog closed in tighter, swallowing sound. I touched the steel. Cold, colder than ice, colder than death. I jerked back, heart hammering, gloves smeared black. The liquid clung like tar, sticky, refusing to let go. I wiped it against the rail, but it smeared wider, darker. My stomach lurched. Behind me, the men laughed again, some crude joke about treasure. Their voices felt wrong in the fog, thin and distant, like they came from underwater. I wanted to shout at them, tell them to stop, tell them to listen, but all I could do was stare at my hand, the black smear glistening under the deck lights. I knew then. Whatever had been sealed inside this wreck hadn't been meant to escape, and we'd just given it a way out. The hatch gave a low shudder, metal flexing outward for the briefest moment. The liquid dripped faster, pooling now, crawling across the deck toward my boots. And in that moment, everything I thought I knew about wrecks, about war, about history itself, shattered. Because wrecks didn't bleed. The hatch bled a liquid thicker than oil and colder than blood. That morning, the wreck finally gave up its secret. The men had grown restless. They were used to relics, to the routine of raising and recording. But the ooze spilling from the seams, the fog that clung too heavy to the rails, the way I barked orders with a voice not my own, it gnawed at them. And when men are gnawed at, they get reckless. "Chief," Cruz muttered, standing beside me, his eyes never leaving the black trail spreading across the deck. "We can't just leave it like that." I didn't answer right away. My lungs still burned from the stench, my gloves still smeared with the greasy stain. Every instinct screamed to let it lie, to push it back into the sea, to pretend we'd never touched it. But duty has a way of silencing instinct, and curiosity it whispers even louder. "Cut it," I finally ordered. The weld seams groaned as torches hissed to life, sparks spitting against the damp steel. The sound set my teeth on edge. I watched the men lean in, their faces hidden behind masks, orange fire tracing lines where someone, decades ago, had sealed this plane shut forever. Why seal it? Why bury it so deep? The answer waited just beyond the metal. I felt my father's words rattling in my skull. Some wrecks weren't sunk, they were buried. His war had ended in stories of heroes and valor, of men who fought and died for something greater. But here I stood, watching sparks eat into metal that had been locked from the outside, knowing in my gut that this wasn't the same war my father had told me about. This was something else. The last torch sputtered, metal hissing as it cooled. The hatch groaned. Cruz shoved his crowbar into the seam and heaved. The hatch screamed open. At first, the men fell silent, expecting bones. The fragile collapse of history waiting to be cradled and mourned. A cockpit skeleton, a rusted seatbelt clasp still clutching a ribcage, a pilot's ghost returned. But there were no bones. Instead, the light caught fabric crisp, preserved, impossibly intact. A uniform lay folded neatly, draped across the seat as though it had just been set down yesterday. The colors hadn't faded, the stitching still sharp, not eaten by salt or time, not touched by decay. My breath caught. I reached forward, fingertips trembling above the cloth. It wasn't American. The insignia was foreign, the style unfamiliar, the patches stitched in patterns I couldn't place. Whose bird was this?" one of the men whispered. No one answered, because the real answer sat behind the uniform. Crates, stacked, sealed, wedged into the fuselage where seats should have been. Metal, unmarked except for the lines of strange lettering burned across their lids. Letters none of us could read, not English, not any language I'd seen in my decades of diving. The air that rolled out with them carried a weight, heavy and chemical, thick enough to sting my eyes. My chest locked tight. I gagged and staggered back, glove pressed against my mask. But still, I couldn't look away. "My father's war had heroes and bones," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. This thing had neither. The men didn't hear me. They were too busy staring at the crates. Cruz reached out and touched one, his gloved hand tracing the foreign letters. He jerked back immediately, shaking his fingers like they'd been burned. The metal gleamed wet in the dim deck light. And then I saw it, the symbols carved deep into the steel, sharp and deliberate, etched as though the crates themselves had been branded with warnings. The lines glistened as if sweating, moisture seeping out from within. My gut twisted. It wasn't moisture. It was something else. The men murmured, shuffled, shifted uneasily. Their laughter was gone now, stripped away with the hatch. What remained was silence, broken only by the drip of black liquid still leaking from the fuselage. I forced myself closer, peering down at the rows inside. They stretched deeper than they should have. Too many for a plane this size. packed too tight, too deliberate. This wasn't cargo, it was containment. And suddenly I understood why the welds were there, why the hatch had been sealed, why the ocean had been chosen as the grave. Not to hide it, but to keep it down. The fog curled tighter around the deck, swallowing the edges of the plane until only the open hatch and its secrets glowed in the dim light. My gloves were wet, my throat raw, my chest aching, but I couldn't move. The men waited for me to speak, to explain, to make sense of it. But there was nothing to say, because this wasn't sense. This was horror. This was war's forgotten sin, clawing its way back into the air. And as I stared at those unreadable marks, carved deep into sweating steel, I knew we weren't meant to see this. Symbols no one could read gleamed wet, as if the metal itself were sweating. Would you call for help if you saw the ground breathing? But the discovery refused to stay buried. That night, long after the deck had gone quiet and the men had shuffled off to their bunks, I lay awake in my cabin, staring at the ceiling. The ship rocked gently, but there was no comfort in the rhythm. Every creak of steel sounded like the groan of that plane. Every drip of condensation echoed like something dripping out of those crates. The smell clung to me. I'd scrubbed my hands raw, scoured my gloves with solvent, even changed my shirt. None of it mattered. The chemical sweetness lingered, faint but relentless, sitting in my lungs like a parasite. I turned onto my side, closed my eyes, willed sleep to come. It came in fragments. Dreams of water pressing down on me, black and endless. Dreams of pilots clawing at glass, their helmets fogged, mouths opening in silent screams. Dreams of crates rattling in the dark, letters glowing faint on sweating steel, and then the whispers. I don't know if I dreamed them or heard them. Low, muffled voices just beyond the bulkhead, words I couldn't make out. I sat up in my bunk, heart hammering, ears straining. Nothing. Just the groan of the hull, the slow churn of the propellers. I told myself it was in my head. Stress, fatigue. But when I finally lay back down, I heard it again, a dull, steady thump. Like something knocking. I held my breath. The sound came again. 3 beats, a pause, then 2 more. It was coming from the deck above, from the wreck. I sat up fast, pulling my boots on with shaking hands. My throat burned with the chemical taste, gagging me as I moved through the passageways. The ship was dark, only red safety lights glowing along the bulkheads. My footsteps echoed too loud, out of sync with the thumping I followed. I climbed the ladder and pushed open the hatch to the deck. Fog pressed in, thicker than before. It swirled around my ankles, curled over the rails, turned the plane into a looming shadow in the glow of the floodlights. The smell hit me again, sharp enough to water my eyes. The thumping was louder now, not constant, uneven, like something shifting inside one of the crates. Cruz was already there, leaning against the rail with a cigarette. He startled when he saw me. Couldn't sleep either? I shook my head, eyes locked on the wreck. You hear it? He hesitated, then nodded. Thought it was just me. We stood there in silence, listening. The fog swallowed sound, but the thumping carried, muffled and heavy. Cruz flicked his cigarette away, his hand trembling. Chief, maybe we should call it in. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell him we were in over our heads, that this was bigger than salvage, bigger than us. But the words died in my throat. My father's voice filled the silence instead. Some wrecks weren't sunk, they were buried. And we dug one up. I stepped closer to the fuselage. The hatch still gaped open. The crates lined up inside like teeth in a black mouth. One of them sat slightly askew. Its straps loosened. Its lid tilted open just a fraction. I felt bile rise in my throat. Cruz whispered, Chief, don't. But I couldn't stop myself. I leaned closer, peering into the gap. Something white dusted the edges, fine like ash, spilling in a thin trail down the side. It drifted in the fog like snow, settling on the deck in tiny heaps. I reached out with my glove and brushed it. The powder clung instantly, sticky against the fabric, searing my skin beneath. My stomach turned. And then the lid rattled just once, but loud enough that Cruz cursed and stumbled back. I staggered too, heart slamming against my ribs. The powder spilled heavier, cascading in a thin stream, sliding across the deck like it had weight, like it knew where it wanted to go. I slapped at my glove, trying to shake it off, gagging as the chemical sting doubled in my throat. The powder moved against me, clinging tighter, as if it had a will of its own. Cruz shouted, Shut it! Shut the damn thing! Together we slammed the lid back down, cinching the straps until the metal screamed. My hands shook so bad I nearly dropped the buckle. And then, silence. The crate sat still, the powder trail cut off midstream. My chest heaved, lungs burning, eyes watering. Cruz doubled over, coughing hard, his face pale in the floodlights. We stood there for what felt like hours, waiting, listening, daring it to move again. It didn't. Finally, Cruz rasped, "What the hell was that?" I couldn't answer, because I didn't know. All I knew was the sound, the echo of the lid rattling, and the way it still vibrated in my bones, long after the straps were tight again. The echo lingered as if the crate itself was still breathing. By morning, I was no longer the only one who noticed. The fog had rolled inland overnight, pressing low over the harbor, muffling the cries of gulls until the docks felt smothered in cotton. Our ship sat heavy at the pier, the wreck still strapped to its deck like some corpse we were too afraid to bury. I hadn't slept. Neither had Cruz. I could see it in the red rims of his eyes, the tremor in his hands when he lit his morning cigarette. The others tried to act normal, cracking jokes over coffee, but their voices rang hollow. Every man stole glances at the plane, their words faltering each time the hatch groaned against its straps. Word had spread fast. By sunrise, locals stood along the pier fence, faces pale in the mist. Kids with bikes leaned against the railing, daring each other to spit toward the wreck. Old women whispered, hands tight around their shawls. One boy slipped through, darting toward the puddle of black liquid seeping from the fuselage. "Bet you won't touch it," another jeered. The boy crouched, grinning, and ran his fingers through the oily sheen. He didn't grin long. By the time he yanked his hand back, the skin was already red and blistering, as if the liquid had boiled him from the outside in. His scream ripped through the fog, shrill and ragged, scattering the kids back toward the fence. I sprinted forward, grabbing him by the collar, hauling him clear. His palm was raw, skin puckered and white at the edges, the kind of wound I'd seen men carry after chemical burns. "Get him to the dock," Cruz barked, shoving the boy toward a sailor. The crowd at the fence surged, voices rising, questions flying. "What's in there? Why ain't it locked up? Is it poison?" I wanted to shout answers. I wanted to say we had it under control. But my throat burned, and no words came. The old fisherman came forward then, his oilskin coat dripping with mist, his face carved by decades of sea wind. He didn't look at me, not at first. His eyes stayed fixed on the plane, on the hatch strapped tight, on the crates that sat inside like teeth in a dark jaw. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, heavy with something older than fear. "No storm dropped this here," he said, each word deliberate. "Men did, and they planted it to be feared." The crowd hushed. Even the kids stopped their whispering. His words hung in the fog like a curse. I felt every eye turn to me, waiting, demanding. But what could I say? That he was wrong? That the welds were natural? The crates harmless? The liquid just old fuel? I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. The lie caught in my throat, choked by the sting that never left my lungs. Cruz stepped forward instead. "Back off," he snapped, voice sharp as a whip. "This is Navy business." The fisherman's gaze shifted to him, then to me. Finally, he shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and melted back into the fog. The crowd didn't disperse, though. They stayed at the fence, whispering, pointing, eyes locked on the wreck. A few slipped away, no doubt to tell their families, their neighbors. By noon, the whole town would know. I turned back to the plane. The hatch straps vibrated faintly, twitching as though something inside still pushed against them. The crates glistened in the floodlights, sweat-beaded steel etched with unreadable warnings. And in that moment, I realized the truth. The ocean hadn't kept this secret by accident. It had been forced down, locked away, sealed beneath decades of salt and silence. And we were the fools who dragged it back into the light. No storm dropped this here. Men did, and they planted it to be feared. The secret was no longer mine alone. By noon, the pier swarmed with people. They pressed against the chain-link fence, fog curling between them, voices sharp and frantic. Word had spread faster than tidewater about the plane. The burn on the boy's hand, the black ooze dripping from seams no storm could have made. Rumors swirled like gulls over scraps. "It's treasure Nazi gold." "No, it's poison. That's why they sank it." My grandfather said planes like that carried experiments, men they didn't want coming home. Each whisper was louder than the last, layered with fear and hunger. Some faces gleamed with greed, others with dread. Children darted under arms, climbing the fence to point at the shadowy wreck hulking on our deck. Every time the hatch straps rattled, the crowd flinched as one. The sheriff arrived just past midday. Sheriff Dalton, broad-shouldered, red-faced, his hat pulled low against the mist. He was a man used to cattle disputes, drunks at the bar, an occasional stolen truck. Not this. Not a corpse of war dripping black poison at the town's doorstep. He pushed through the crowd, muttering to deputies to keep folks back. His boots clanged heavy as he stepped aboard. For a moment he just stood there, staring at the wreck, his jaw clenching and unclenching. "You hauled this thing out of the bay?" he finally asked. I nodded. "Routine recovery. Or, it was supposed to be." He walked closer, eyes narrowing at the hatch, at the strange crates stacked inside. His hand trembled as he struck a match for his cigarette. The flame sputtered in the damp air, shaking with his fingers. "Those markings," he said slowly, his voice dropping. "Those ain't ours." "No," I admitted, "they're not." He dragged on the cigarette, exhaled smoke into the fog. It curled back in his face, dissolving like a lie before it left his lips. Behind us, the crowd pressed louder against the fence. Shouts rose. "Shut it down! Get rid of it! Tell us what's inside!" Deputies struggled to hold them back. The fence groaned under their weight. Dalton glanced over his shoulder, then back at me. "You'll have answers tomorrow," he said. His voice was rough. Too rough. He tried to make it sound firm, but his match still shook as he lit another cigarette. The smoke curled and vanished into the mist, and in that moment I knew he didn't believe himself. Neither did I. The smell burned stronger now, sour-sweet and chemical, clinging to my skin no matter how I scrubbed. My head throbbed with it, a drumbeat behind my eyes. Every breath was work, as though the air itself had turned against me. I staggered to the rail, pressing my hands into the cold steel. For a second, I imagined diving into the water, scrubbing myself clean, letting the tide strip the stink away. But I knew it wouldn't. It lived deeper now, inside me, stitched into my lungs. Cruz stepped up beside me, voice low. "Chief," the sheriff spooked, "that means the rest of us ought to be terrified." He wasn't wrong. Because if Dalton, a man who once wrestled a drunk out of a burning truck with nothing but his bare hands, was shaking at the sight of this wreck, then what did that say about what we'd pulled up? The fog thickened, pressing heavier, muffling the crowd until their shouts sounded distant, distorted, like voices from underwater. I turned back toward the plane, the hatch still glistening, straps quivering faintly like breath beneath fabric. We'd dragged it up from the deep, and now it was dragging all of us down with it. He promised answers tomorrow, but his match shook, and the smoke curled into the fog like a lie. Now the law stood at my fence line. By dawn the next day, the crowd had doubled. Reporters jostled with fishermen's wives, deputies shoved back teenagers climbing for a better look, and the fog pressed low, swallowing voices until they sounded like chants in a cathedral. The boy's blistered hand had already become a story, retold 100 ways, poison, acid, even curses. Then the black vans arrived. They rolled in slow, engines humming low, windows tinted. Men in uniforms I didn't recognize stepped out first, not Dalton's deputies, not county boys. Navy patches, but cleaner, sharper. Their boots hit the dock like hammers, and the chatter of the crowd broke into a hush. Behind them came the suits tall, thin men carrying cases, their collars stiff, their voices clipped. The Navy officer in charge strode straight to me. "Commander Hayes," he said, voice flat as paper. "You'll step aside now." I stiffened, swallowing the burn still gnawing my throat. "This is my operation, my team." "Not anymore," he cut me off. "Containment protocols are in effect. Containment." The word sank through me like a lead weight. Behind us, the cranes groaned as new equipment was wheeled onto the dock, scanning rigs, Geiger counters, things that hummed and clicked as they powered up. The men in suits whispered to each other, passing files back and forth, their eyes flicking toward the wreck like they couldn't look too long. The reporters surged, cameras flashing like lightning in the fog. Questions flew. Is it chemical? Is it a weapon? Is it foreign? Dalton's deputies pushed them back, but not far enough. Every time the flashbulbs popped, the symbols on the crates inside the hatch seemed to gleam wetter, sharper, as though the light woke them. I tried to stand my ground. "What's in there?" "We found it. My crew." The officer's eyes locked on mine, hard and unblinking. "You found nothing. Do you understand?" Cruz shifted behind me, muttering a curse. One of the younger divers clenched his fists, looking ready to throw himself at the officer. I raised a hand to steady them. This wasn't a fight we could win. The men in suits moved past us, setting their scanners against the fuselage. The machines whined, lights flickering, needles jerking higher than they should have. One suit leaned in close, whispering sharp, his face paling. Another snapped a case shut and barked for more equipment. They weren't inspecting, they were panicking. I stepped closer, trying to listen, but two sailors blocked my path. Their expressions were blank, eyes hard. Guards. Against me. Against my own men. The crowd roared behind the fence, voices blending into a storm of fear and fascination. Tell us the truth. Is it safe? What are you hiding? The fence rattled, deputies shouting as hands shook the chain links. The Navy officer barked into his radio. More men rolled in heavy drills, long hoses. Machinery meant not for salvage, but for excavation. My stomach twisted. They weren't done with the wreck. They were going back under. I grabbed Cruz's arm, leaning close. They're not just taking the plane, they're digging deeper. He stared at me, eyes wide. Deeper? Chief, what the hell else is down there? The drills lowered toward the water, engines roaring to life. The sound tore through the fog, vibrating in my teeth, drowning out the crowd. The bay churned as steel bit into it, water foaming white. The groan of machinery echoing across the harbor like the bay itself was crying out. The suits watched the monitors, their faces pale, their lips tight. Not one of them looked relieved. The crowd fell silent then, watching too, their breaths held in unison. Even Dalton stood frozen, his cigarette forgotten, ash lengthening between his fingers. And me? I felt hollow, stripped. It wasn't mine anymore. Whatever secret we'd raised had grown beyond us, beyond me, beyond my crew, beyond this town. It belonged now to men who whispered in codes, who carried machines that shook when they touched the wreck, who ordered drills into water like they were gutting a body. And standing there, chest burning, throat raw, I realized the truth. I had unleashed something I couldn't stop. The drills sank into the bay, as if gutting a living thing. Do you think this is natural, or something far darker? What the experts saw made their faces turn pale. The drills chewed through the bay floor all morning, their growl mixing with the hiss of foghorns and the shouts of deputies trying to hold back the crowd. My crew and I stood useless at the rail, boxed out by sailors in fresh uniforms and men in black suits who wouldn't meet our eyes. Every few minutes, the suits huddled around their monitors. The screens glowed green in the fog, sonar lines spiking, shadows shifting. At first, I thought it was just debris wreckage from the plane we'd hauled up, scattered across the bay floor. But then one of the men swore under his breath, loud enough that even the crowd hushed. Another wreck. I leaned closer, heart climbing into my throat. What is that? I demanded. No one answered. But I saw it clearly on the screen, the outline of another fuselage. Same shape, same size, buried deeper, cables still tethering it to the first. It hadn't crashed alone, Cruz muttered. Mother of God! His voice cracked like glass. I felt my knees weaken, hands gripping the rail so hard the metal bit into my palms. One wreck was bad enough. One secret sealed and buried could still be called a mistake, an accident. But two, connected, deliberately chained beneath the mud? This wasn't history lost. This was history hidden. The officer barked into his radio, snapping orders, his voice sharp with panic. The crowd at the fence surged, their questions turning to shouts. How many more? What are you digging up? Is it safe? Dalton pushed through, yelling for calm, but his face was ashen. The match shook so badly he couldn't light his cigarette. The drills rose, chains dripping mud, and the divers prepared to go back down. Reporters shoved cameras high, snapping frenzied shots through the fog. The flashbulbs lit the suits' faces white, and for the first time, I saw it plainly fear. Real, bone-deep fear. I couldn't stay quiet. You're not supposed to find this, I said, voice raw from the sting still clawing my lungs. This was buried on purpose. The officer turned to me then, eyes sharp as glass. Keep your mouth shut, Commander. That's an order. But he couldn't hide it. His pupils were wide, his jaw tight, and when he turned back to the monitors, I heard him mutter to his deputy low, but not low enough. This was meant to stay buried even from us. The words slammed through me like cold water. Even from us. The crowd erupted again, pushing against the fence until it bowed inward. Deputies shouted, rifles raised, trying to keep them back. Reporters screamed questions over the noise, their voices frantic, desperate for a headline that would make sense of this madness. But there was no sense. Only dread. The bay itself seemed to recoil. The water boiled where the drills had bitten into the floor, foam spreading white across the black surface. The fog pressed heavier, curling tighter around us until the wreck loomed like a tombstone on the deck. I looked at Cruz. His face was pale, lips tight. He shook his head slowly, as though trying to wake from a nightmare. "Chief, if there's two, there could be more." The thought hollowed me out. How many planes had been sunk here? How many sealed, welded shut, chained together and dropped into the dark? How many secrets waited beneath us, sweating poison into the sea? The officer barked new orders, pulling men toward the water, preparing for a second recovery. But his voice cracked, just once, and that was enough. Enough to tell me he was as terrified as the rest of us. I turned back to the wreck on our deck, its hatch still gaping, the crates lined up like coffins inside. The unreadable symbols gleamed wet in the floodlight, sweating more each hour. The crowd screamed, the deputies braced, the Navy scrambled, and all I could think was, if one was too dangerous to leave afloat, what did it mean that they'd buried two? This wasn't lost history, son, it was buried on purpose. By nightfall, the whole town was talking. News vans lined the docks, their antennas stabbing into the fog, lights casting harsh beams across the water. Reporters crowded the fence, their microphones thrust forward like weapons, shouting over one another. Every few minutes, another outlet went live, breaking news from the harbor. Their words carried far, echoing down Main Street, bouncing between the shuttered shops. Locals flooded in too. Some came to gawk, others to demand answers. Men in flannel shirts clutched shotguns across their chests. Mothers dragged children by the arm, whispering about poison in the air. In the water, teenagers climbed the fence, filming grainy videos on their phones, daring each other to spit toward the plane. Dalton's deputies struggled to hold them back. The fence rattled and groaned, bolts straining as the crowd pressed harder. Shouts rose like a tide. "Tell us what you found. Shut it down before it kills us all. You hiding bodies in there?" Each question stabbed sharper than the last. But none had an answer. On deck, the suits barked orders into radios, dragging more equipment toward the water. They didn't care about the crowd, didn't care about the fear. All that mattered was the second wreck below. Cruz leaned close to me, voice low, urgent. "Chief, they're losing control." He was right. The mob surged again, snapping the top bar of the fence. Deputies raised rifles, their hands shaking. Reporters pushed forward, cameras flashing like lightning in the fog. One of them locked eyes with me, shouting over the chaos. "What did you see in there, diver?" My throat burned. My chest felt raw. For a heartbeat, I thought of my father, of his quiet warnings, his silence heavier than words. I thought of the boy's blistered hand, of the crate rattling in the fog, of the black ooze dripping into the sea. I met the reporter's gaze. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." The words hung in the mist, caught between us. The reporter blinked, stunned, his microphone lowering slightly. And then the rifles cracked. The sound tore the night open. Deputies fired into the air, the sharp report scattering gulls into the fog. The crowd shrieked, panic erupting like a dam breaking. People shoved and clawed at each other, stumbling over bikes, trampling spilled coffee cups, scattering into the alleys like prey fleeing a hunter. Cameras hit the ground, shattering. Microphones clattered across the dock. The smell of gunpowder curled into the already sour air, mixing with the chemical sting that never left my throat. I gripped the rail, knuckles white, watching the chaos ripple outward. The harbor lights glared against the fog, turning the scene into a battlefield of shadows and flashes. The wreck sat silent behind me, its open hatch yawning, crates sweating in the floodlight. It didn't need to move. It didn't need to groan. It had already done its work. It had turned a quiet town into a riot. Then rifles cracked, and the crowd scattered like prey. Then came the men who spoke in whispers. The riot scattered the docks. But it didn't end the storm. By dawn, the crowd had thinned, leaving broken fences, shattered cameras, and bloodied footprints in the fog. Reporters had been shoved back, locals driven home by rifle fire. But the whisper of what we'd found ran deeper than bullets could reach. That was when the black cars rolled in. They moved without headlights, their engines purring low, their tires crunching on gravel. Men in dark coats stepped out first, their shoes polished, their faces set like stone. They didn't shout, they didn't posture, they didn't need to. Everyone fell quiet. One of them, tall, thin, a gray streak in his hair, walked straight past Dalton, straight past the Navy officers, straight up the gangway. He didn't even glance at me until he was close enough for me to smell the faint tang of cologne under the chemical air. "You're Commander Hayes," he said. Not a question. I nodded, throat tight. He looked past me at the wreck, at the hatch still strapped, at the crates sweating in the floodlights. His jaw ticked once. Then he turned back, his voice low and sharp. "This never happened." The words landed like a hammer. Behind him, his men moved quickly. Cases opened, folders passed hand to hand. Radios crackled with orders I couldn't catch. They herded my crew off the deck, shoving them toward the mess with clipped words. "Wait there, keep quiet, no questions." Crews resisted, snarling, but one hard stare from the gray-haired man silenced him. He shot me a look as he was dragged away, fear, fury, and something else. A plea. I wanted to fight. I wanted to shove back, to demand answers, to remind them this was my operation. But my body betrayed me. My hands trembled, my chest burned with a sting that never left, and all I could do was stand there, hollow, as they erased us. The gray-haired man leaned closer. His whisper was almost kind. "Go home, Commander. Forget this. For your own sake." But how could I? How could I forget the boy's burned hand, the crates rattling in the fog, the unreadable symbols sweating poison into the sea? My anger surged, shaking me awake. I shoved my hand into my jacket, pulled out my notebook, the one where I'd written every detail since we first saw the wreck. I tore a page free, struck a match, and held it until the paper curled black and fell to the deck. The man watched, expression unreadable. "I don't forget," I rasped, my throat burned, my fists shaking. "Not ever." His eyes narrowed. He gave a small nod, then turned away. Behind me, the wreck groaned. The straps quivered, droplets of black liquid splattering onto the deck like blood from a fresh wound. The men in coats ignored it. They only cared about the papers, the photographs, the story. By the time the sun burned pale through the fog, every camera had been confiscated, every notebook sealed. Reporters who lingered too long were shoved into vans and driven out. Locals who dared approach were threatened with trespass and jail. The wreck was still there. The poison was still dripping. The crates were still sweating. But officially, it no longer existed. That night, I sat alone in my cabin, staring at the ashes of my notes. My fists still trembled, my chest still raw. Outside my window, a black car idled at the fence, its headlights dark, its engine humming soft. Waiting, watching. That night, a black car idled at my fence, waiting in silence. Every shadow now felt like a watcher. I couldn't walk the pier without feeling eyes on my back. The fishermen who once waved now turned away. Strangers leaned too long against lampposts, their hats pulled low. At night, footsteps echoed behind me, always stopping when I turned. The black car never left. Some nights it idled at the edge of my fence, headlights off, engine humming steady. Other nights it parked 2 blocks away, just far enough to make me doubt if I truly saw it through the mist. But I always heard it, a low purr that threaded into my dreams. My phone rang twice in the middle of the night. No number, no voice, just silence. I stopped answering after that. Inside my house, the smell clung. I'd left my gear outside, scrubbed my boots, even thrown my gloves in the bin. Still, the chemical sting lingered, faint but constant, like it had stitched itself into my lungs. Every breath reminded me of the crates, of the powder that moved like it was alive, of the boy's blistered hand. I barely slept. When I did, I dreamed of the hatch rattling, of straps snapping, of black liquid spilling across the floor, filling my house, rising past my knees, my chest, my mouth. I'd wake choking, clutching my throat, sure I was drowning on dry land. Cruz came once. He didn't knock, just let himself in. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. "They told me to shut up," he said. "They told me if I talked, my wife would pay for it." His voice cracked. "Chief, what are we supposed to do?" I had no answer, because I'd heard the same warning, not in words, but in the silence pressing in on every corner of my life. We sat at my kitchen table, staring at the dog tag I kept there, my father's. I'd held on to it through every dive, every storm. His war had been clean in memory. Lines drawn, heroes honored, secrets buried only by time. Mine was nothing but rot clawing its way out of the deep. Cruz slammed his fist against the wood, making the tag jump. "We can't just let them bury it again." My chest heaved. I wanted to agree. I wanted to shout, to tear the truth into the world before they drowned it in lies. But outside, the hum of the black car grew louder, closer, like it was leaning against the wall of my house. I lowered my voice, barely more than a whisper. If we speak, they'll bury us with it. The words broke him. He pressed his hands to his face, shoulders shaking, and left without another word. That night, I sat alone again, staring at the tag glinting in the dim light. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the metal cold, biting into my skin. The humming in the distance grew louder, joined by a faint vibration in the ground, as if drills still gnawed at the bay floor miles away. The crates weren't gone. Not really. The sound carried in my bones, the same dull rhythm I'd heard on the deck, the same beat that once rattled the straps. The silence in my house grew heavy, pressing against my ears until I thought my skull might split. I clutched the dog tag and whispered into the empty room. Do I shout the truth, or let the ocean drag it down with me? And the silence answered back, not with comfort, but with weight. The silence pressed in, heavier than words, demanding I choose. If this happened to you, what would you do? And then the last secret broke free. The Navy officer came back 3 days later, not with drills or scanners, but with papers. He slid them across Dalton's desk, his voice clipped, rehearsed. Routine salvage. No anomalies. Plane recovered, content destroyed. Destroyed. I sat in the corner, silent, watching Dalton nod along like a schoolboy before a headmaster. His ashtray overflowed, his matches trembling as he struck one after another. When the officer left, Dalton buried his face in his hands. I waited until we were alone. You knew, I said. My voice was flat, dead. He didn't answer. You knew it wasn't routine, from the start. Still nothing. Just the scratch of his match, the hiss of smoke. His silence was worse than any confession. The betrayal cut deeper than the chemical sting in my throat. This wasn't just the Navy. It wasn't just outsiders. It was home. That night, I couldn't stay inside. The walls pressed too close, the silence too heavy. I walked the pier, fog curling low, the sea black as tar. My boots echoed against the boards. That was when I heard the voices, not whispers, shouts. I followed the sound to the harbor's edge, where a cluster of locals huddled around a flickering laptop. Grainy satellite images glowed on the screen, washed green like sonar. Not one wreck, not two, dozens. Shadows lined the coast. Fuselages stretched in neat rows beneath the waves, like coffins in a drowned graveyard. Each one identical, each one tethered in place, each one welded shut. A woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. A fisherman muttered a prayer. Another man spat on the dock. Someone turned to me. You saw inside. Tell us. I couldn't. The words locked in my throat. All I could see was the boy's burned hand, the crates sweating in the floodlight, the symbols no one could read. Cruz pushed through the crowd, his eyes wild. It wasn't an accident, he hissed. They planted them here, buried them, and they knew. His hand shook as he pointed at Dalton's office across the street. He knew. They all knew. The crowd turned as one, faces twisted with fury, betrayal. Dalton's window glowed faint, his shadow moving inside. The mob surged forward, voices rising, fists pounding the door. I wanted to stop them. I wanted to shout that it wouldn't matter, that tearing Dalton apart wouldn't lift what slept beneath the sea. But I didn't move, because deep down, I knew Cruz was right. Dalton had known. Maybe the whole town had known. And still, they'd let us drag it back up. I looked back at the laptop, at the rows of shadows beneath the waves. My stomach dropped, cold spreading through me like the black liquid itself. If one wreck could bleed, if one crate could rattle, if one powder could move like it lived, what would dozens do? The fog pressed tighter, swallowing the dock, muffling the crowd until their roars sounded distant, distorted. The sea lapped gently against the pilings, steady and indifferent as though mocking our panic. And in that moment I understood the truth. This wasn't a mistake. It was a plan. Dozens of shadows slept beneath the waves, waiting. But some secrets never truly stay buried. Weeks passed, yet the smell clung to me. No soap cut it, no salt wind carried it away. It lived inside, stitched into my lungs. A reminder that what I'd seen was not a nightmare, but a truth clawing its way to the surface. I stopped diving. I stopped taking calls from the Navy. My gear gathered dust in the shed, straps stiff, buckles rusting. The ocean that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a predator waiting just beyond the breakers. Most nights, I sat at the kitchen table, turning my father's dog tag over in my hands. The edges had worn smooth with years of touch, but it still felt heavy as a chain. His war had been clean in story, if not in blood. Mine was nothing but silence, lies, and shadows left to rot in the deep. The town didn't recover, not really. The fence at the docks was rebuilt, taller this time, topped with barbed wire. Armed men patrolled it night and day, their faces hidden behind mirrored glasses. Locals whispered as they passed, but never loud enough for the guards to hear. Shops closed early. Fishermen avoided the bay, setting their nets farther out. Kids no longer raced bikes to the pier, not after the boy with the burned hand was sent away, his family vanishing overnight. People asked where they went, but no one dared answer. And Dalton? His office stayed lit night after night. He smoked until the curtains turned yellow, his matches trembling worse than ever. When folks muttered in the diner, they said his silence cost more than his soul. Reporters tried to come back, but the black cars waited for them, engines idling. They left with notebooks empty, cameras wiped clean, eyes hollow. The wreck on our deck disappeared one morning. No warning, no noise, just gone, like the sea had reclaimed it. But I knew better. It hadn't been taken back. It had been moved, buried again, somewhere deeper, somewhere darker. And yet the sea spoke still. Sometimes, on fog-heavy nights, I'd hear it from my porch, a low hum rising from the harbor, faint but steady, like chains straining in the deep, like metal groaning against pressure. I'd sit there with the dog tag in my palm, the metal cold against my skin, and wonder if it was only memory echoing, or if it was the shadows below, reminding me they weren't gone, only waiting. Cruz never came back after that last night. Word was he moved inland, far from water. But I sometimes thought I saw him in the mist, a shape leaning at the edge of my fence, watching, waiting, just like the black car had. The ocean doesn't give back what it takes. That's what I'd always believed. But now I knew the darker truth. Sometimes the ocean keeps things not to hide them, but to protect us from them. My father said the ocean kept secrets. He was right. The sea still hides how many more.